It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine, Princess of Wales's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something had shifted. And within hours, a decision would emerge that stunned even the most seasoned royal insiders. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded behind those closed doors was not the kind of routine discussion that typically shapes a royal schedule. This was something heavier, something layered with urgency and quiet tension. Reports suggest that Catherine had been summoned alongside Prince William and a tightly selected circle of senior advisors, individuals whose presence alone hinted at the seriousness of the moment. These were not casual consultations. These were the kind of meetings where decisions are weighed not just for days, but for their lasting impact on the monarchy itself. And yet, no official record would acknowledge what truly passed between them. Within hours, something unprecedented happened. Catherine's carefully structured calendar, known for its precision and unwavering reliability, shifted without warning. Engagements that had been confirmed weeks in advance were quietly withdrawn. No detailed explanation. No reassuring follow-up. Just silence. To the public, it appeared as a simple adjustment. But to those familiar with royal protocol, it was anything but ordinary. Because cancellations at this level, especially from someone as consistent as Catherine, rarely happen without significant cause. And when they do, they are almost always accompanied by a narrative. This time, there was none. Inside the palace, the atmosphere reportedly tightened. Staff who once moved with calm efficiency became noticeably guarded. Conversations that would normally flow freely were suddenly cut short. Insiders whisper that aides were given clear, unspoken instructions to say nothing, to confirm nothing, to allow speculation to drift without interference. It was an unusual level of restraint for an institution that typically manages perception with meticulous care. The silence itself became its own message, louder than any official statement could have been. Outside, the cameras caught something equally telling. As Catherine stepped out following that meeting, there was a subtle shift in her composure, one that did not go unnoticed. It wasn't dramatic. There were no outward displays of distress. But seasoned photographers, those who have followed her for years, recognized the difference immediately. The slight pause before acknowledging the press. The controlled, almost deliberate stillness in her expression. It was the kind of moment that speaks volumes precisely because so little is said. And then came the whispers. At first they were scattered, almost hesitant. A quiet suggestion here, a passing comment there. But within days, those murmurs began to align into something more coherent. Media insiders began hinting that something serious had been unfolding behind the scenes for weeks, something that had finally reached a tipping point. The timing, the secrecy, the sudden shift, it all pointed toward a situation that had been carefully contained until it no longer could be. What made it even more unsettling was how quickly the narrative changed. One moment, everything appeared stable, controlled, predictable. The next, there was a noticeable fracture, subtle, but undeniable. And as speculation grew, so did the sense that this was not just another fleeting royal adjustment. This was something deeper, something personal, something that had forced Catherine into a decision she would not have taken lightly. Because within the world of the monarchy, where duty is often placed above all else, stepping back even briefly carries weight. It signals priority. It signals urgency. And above all, it signals that something behind the scenes has shifted enough to override even the most sacred of commitments. But what truly alarmed insiders wasn't just the secrecy, it was the event Catherine chose to abandon. For years, this event had been more than a date on the royal calendar. It was a symbol of continuity, grace, and unwavering duty. And Catherine, Princess of Wales, had never missed it. Not once. Until now. Her absence wasn't just unexpected, it was almost unthinkable. So what could possibly justify breaking a tradition so deeply woven into the monarchy's public identity? To understand the weight of this moment, one has to look beyond the ceremony itself and into what it represents. This was not merely a gathering or a public display, it was a living thread connecting generations, a ritual that reinforced the monarchy's promise of stability to the nation. Events like Trooping the Color are not optional appearances, they are declarations of presence, reminders that the institution endures regardless of the pressures surrounding it. And Catherine, since stepping into her role, had embodied that principle with near-perfect consistency. She was not just present, she was composed, measured, unwavering, even under scrutiny that would overwhelm most. That is why her absence struck such a powerful chord. Because this was a woman who had built her public identity on reliability. No sudden withdrawals, no unexplained gaps. Even during moments of intense personal pressure, she had maintained that delicate balance between private life and public duty. It was, in many ways, her defining strength, and now, that strength appeared to have been overridden by something far greater. The reaction was immediate, and it was telling. Media outlets that usually approach royal scheduling changes with routine detachment began to shift tone. There was confusion, certainly, but also a quiet sense of disbelief. Commentators who had followed the monarchy for decades began asking questions not typically raised over a single absence. Why now? Why this event? Why Catherine? The consistency that once defined her suddenly became the very reason her absence felt so significant. Inside royal circles, the implications were even more profound. Because when a figure like Catherine steps away from something so symbolically important, it is never taken lightly. It signals a break not just in routine, but in expectation. And within the monarchy, expectation is everything. It is the invisible structure that holds the entire institution together, shaping how duty is performed and how legacy is preserved. To step outside of that structure, even briefly, suggests that something has shifted behind the scenes in a way that cannot simply be ignored. Then came the palace response. Brief, controlled, carefully measured. It spoke of personal considerations and prior commitments, phrases that, on the surface, seemed sufficient. But beneath that polished language, there was a noticeable absence of clarity. No specifics, no reassurance. Just enough information to acknowledge the change, but not enough to explain it. And for those who understand how the palace communicates, that kind of wording carries its own meaning. It suggests restraint, it suggests caution, and perhaps most importantly, it suggests that the full story is not yet ready to be told. Because historically, when the palace chooses ambiguity over detail, it is rarely accidental. It is strategic. It is deliberate. It is a way of controlling the narrative while buying time. And that, more than anything else, began to shift the conversation from simple curiosity to something deeper, something more pressing. Because if this were truly a routine matter, the explanation would have been straightforward. But it wasn't. And so, the absence that once seemed like a single decision began to feel like the surface of a much larger story, one that had been quietly unfolding long before the public ever noticed. A story defined not just by duty, but by pressure, by responsibility, and by choices that carry consequences far beyond a single event. And as questions mounted, the palace's explanation only deepened the mystery. The statement arrived quietly, just a few lines, measured and restrained. It cited personal considerations and prior commitments. But to seasoned royal watchers, the phrasing raised more questions than it answered. Because when the palace chooses its words this carefully, it's usually hiding something far more complex beneath the surface. At first glance, the message seemed almost routine. A short acknowledgement, a polite explanation, a subtle reassurance that everything remained under control. But the more closely it was examined, the more its gaps began to stand out. There were no details about timing, no clarification about duration, no indication of whether this was temporary or part of something more significant. And perhaps most striking of all, no direct reference to Catherine, Princess of Wales herself beyond the bare minimum. For an institution known for its precision, this level of ambiguity was not accidental. Royal correspondents were quick to notice. Those who have spent years decoding palace language began to highlight what wasn't being said, rather than what was. Words like personal considerations are rarely used without intent. They create space for privacy, yes, but also space for uncertainty. And uncertainty, in the world of the monarchy, is rarely left unexamined. Analysts began revisiting similar statements from the past, moments when carefully worded announcements had masked deeper realities. Illnesses that were initially downplayed. Internal tensions that were softened through language before eventually coming to light. The pattern was familiar, and that familiarity only intensified the scrutiny. What made this moment different, however, was the timing. Catherine's absence from such a significant event had already set the stage for concern. The statement, instead of calming those concerns, seemed to validate them in an indirect way. Because if the situation were truly straightforward, the explanation would have reflected that simplicity. Instead, it introduced a layer of distance, a sense that the full picture was being held back, at least for now. Media speculation began to grow, not in a chaotic burst, but in a steady, controlled rise. Commentators started connecting subtle dots, the earlier whispers of tension within the palace, the sudden shift in scheduling, the visible change in Catherine's public demeanor in the days leading up to the announcement. None of these elements alone would have been enough to suggest something serious, but together they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. And then there was the tone. Palace statements are crafted not just for clarity but for reassurance. They are designed to project stability, to maintain confidence in the institution. This one, however, felt different. It was careful, yes. Controlled, certainly. But it lacked the warmth, the subtle sense of resolution that typically accompanies such announcements. Instead, it felt open-ended, as though it were the beginning of a conversation rather than its conclusion. For those watching closely, that distinction mattered, because an open-ended statement invites interpretation. It encourages questions. It creates a space where speculation can take hold and expand, and in this case, that space was quickly filled by a growing sense that something more personal was at the center of it all. Not a scandal, not a dramatic public crisis, but something quieter, something closer, something that could not be easily summarized in a single line of official text. And as the analysis deepened, as more voices began to weigh in, the focus slowly shifted away from the statement itself and toward what it might be protecting. Because in the end, it wasn't just about what the palace said, it was about what it chose not to say. And that silence, more than anything else, began to shape the narrative in ways no official wording ever could. Behind those carefully chosen words, insiders began pointing to something far more personal. Inside Kensington Palace, the atmosphere had reportedly shifted weeks before the announcement. Staff moved differently. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. And at the center of it all was Catherine, Princess of Wales, balancing the weight of duty with something far more demanding behind the scenes. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible. A slight delay here, a rescheduled briefing there. Nothing that would immediately trigger alarm, but enough to create a quiet sense of unease among those who knew the rhythm of palace life, because that rhythm, once disrupted, rarely returns to normal without reason. Insiders suggest that Catherine had been navigating an increasing level of private pressure that did not come with public acknowledgement, but was deeply felt within the walls of her daily life. And unlike the visible demands of royal duty, this was something far less predictable, far less manageable. What made it more complex was the dual role she carried. On one side, there was the expectation, unwavering, constant, deeply rooted in tradition. The future queen, composed and dependable, representing stability in an ever-changing world. On the other side, there was something more immediate, more personal, a responsibility that could not be delegated, postponed, or reshaped to fit a schedule. The balance between those two roles had always been delicate, but now it seemed to be tipping. There were subtle signs. Adjustments to appearances that, on paper, appeared routine but in context told a different story. Engagements shortened, travel plans reconsidered. Moments where Catherine's presence felt more measured, more intentional, as though every appearance required a calculation that had not been necessary before. It wasn't a withdrawal, it was a recalibration. But even recalibration suggests that something has changed. And then there was the growing sense of protection surrounding her family. Reports indicate that attention around her children had quietly intensified, not in a dramatic or public way, but in the kind of careful, deliberate manner that signals concern without inviting scrutiny. Movements became more controlled, access more limited. It was the kind of shift that only becomes visible when compared to what came before, and for those paying close attention, the difference was unmistakable. Through it all, Prince William remained a constant presence. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that reinforced stability. His schedule, too, began to reflect subtle adjustments, moments where his priorities appeared to align more closely with Catherine's, as though both were responding to the same underlying reality. Observers noted the quiet coordination between them, the unspoken understanding that suggested this was not a challenge being faced alone. But even with that support, the strain was building. Because the monarchy does not pause. It does not slow down. It continues, regardless of personal circumstances. And for someone like Catherine, whose commitment to duty has been so clearly defined, stepping back even slightly requires more than necessity. It requires a moment where the usual rules no longer apply. That moment, according to those familiar with the situation, did not arrive suddenly. It built gradually, shaped by weeks of quiet decisions and mounting considerations. Each adjustment, each recalibration, leading toward a point where the balance could no longer hold, where the demands behind the scenes began to outweigh the expectations in front of them. And when that point was finally reached, the decision that followed was not impulsive. It was inevitable. Not a break from duty, but a redefinition of it under circumstances that demanded something more. But the real turning point came when family, not duty, took priority. In a world defined by protocol and precision, Catherine, Princess of Wales, made a choice that cut through centuries of royal expectation. She chose her role not as a future queen but as a mother, and in doing so, she revealed a side of the monarchy rarely seen in public view. For years, Catherine had embodied the balance that so many admired but few truly understood. She carried herself with composure, fulfilled her duties without hesitation, and rarely allowed the weight of her responsibilities to show. But beneath that steady exterior was a reality far more complex. Because beyond the titles, beyond the expectations, there was a family that depended on her in ways the public could never fully see. And when that private world began to demand more of her, the shift was not dramatic, it was deeply personal. There was no official announcement detailing what changed, no confirmation of specific concerns, and perhaps that silence was intentional. Because when it comes to matters involving children, especially within the royal family, discretion is not just preferred, it is essential. Insiders suggest that Catherine's focus had gradually turned inward, toward ensuring stability and reassurance within her own home, not in response to a single moment, but as part of a growing awareness that something required her attention in a way duty alone could not fulfill. That is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The monarchy, by its very nature, prioritizes continuity. It asks its members to stand firm, to represent stability even in times of uncertainty. But motherhood operates on a different set of principles. It is immediate. It is instinctive. It does not wait for the right moment or align itself with public expectations. And when those two forces collide, something has to give. Through it all, Prince William remained not just a partner in duty, but a father navigating the same unspoken reality. His presence during this period carried a different kind of weight, less about public appearances and more about quiet support. Observers noted how his actions seemed to align with Catherine's decisions, reinforcing the sense that this was a shared priority, not an individual one. Together, they appeared to be drawing a line subtle, but significant between what could be postponed and what could not. What followed was a shift in perception that few could have predicted. Instead of criticism, there was understanding. Instead of speculation turning harsh, it softened. The public, often quick to judge, seemed to recognize the human element behind the decision. Because while royal duty may feel distant, the instinct to protect one's family is universal. And in that moment, Catherine was no longer just a figure of tradition, she became something far more relatable. But that relatability came with its own complexity. Because every choice within the monarchy carries consequences beyond the personal. Stepping back, even for the right reasons, creates space that must be filled, explained, managed. And while the decision itself may have been rooted in care and responsibility, its impact extended far beyond the walls of her home. It raised questions about how the monarchy adapts, about how tradition evolves in the face of modern realities, about whether the expectations placed on figures like Catherine can truly remain unchanged in a world that increasingly values authenticity over perfection. And perhaps most importantly, it forced a quiet acknowledgement that even within an institution built on duty, there are moments when humanity takes precedence. That is what made this decision so powerful. Not because it broke tradition, but because it redefined it in a way that felt both necessary and inevitable. A reminder that behind every title, there is a person. Behind every role, a responsibility that cannot always be measured by public appearances alone. Still, the decision didn't just impact her family, it sent ripples across the entire institution. Within hours of the announcement, the palace machinery shifted into motion. Schedules were rewritten, appearances reshuffled, and behind it all, a carefully coordinated effort began to manage the narrative before it spiraled beyond control. This was not chaos, it was calculation. The monarchy, built on centuries of discipline and quiet control, does not allow uncertainty to linger without response. The moment Catherine, Princess of Wales's withdrawal became public, internal systems activated with precision. Engagement lists were reviewed line by line. Commitments were reassigned with careful consideration, ensuring that no visible gap would disrupt the steady rhythm the public had come to expect. Because in the world of the royal institution, continuity is not just important, it is essential to its very survival. Senior figures began stepping forward, some more visibly than others. Their presence was not merely symbolic, it was strategic. Each appearance carried an unspoken message. The institution continues, the duties endure, the structure remains intact. Yet even within that controlled response, there were subtle shifts, small but telling adjustments that suggested this was not a routine redistribution of responsibilities. The tone was more measured, the coordination more deliberate, as though every movement was being carefully weighed against a larger, unseen context. Behind the scenes, aides worked with quiet intensity. Communications teams refined statements, adjusted language, and monitored reactions in real time. Every word mattered. Every phrase carried weight, because the challenge was not just to inform, it was to contain. Speculation, once it begins, has a way of expanding beyond control, and the palace understood this better than anyone. Their approach was not to confront it directly, but to guide it, to shape it through carefully released information and controlled silence. There were no dramatic denials, no sweeping clarifications. Instead, there was restraint, a deliberate choice to provide just enough detail to maintain credibility, while withholding anything that might deepen the conversation. It was a strategy rooted in experience, a recognition that over-explanation can sometimes amplify uncertainty rather than resolve it. And so, the narrative was managed not through confrontation, but through balance. Yet even with that balance, subtle signals began to emerge. The kind that are not announced, but observed. A slight increase in coordination between senior offices, a more cautious tone in public messaging, a noticeable alignment in how different members of the family approached their engagements. Individually, these changes might have seemed insignificant, but together, they suggested something deeper, a shared awareness that this moment required more than routine management. Because while the palace was working to preserve stability, it was also navigating a reality that could not be fully controlled. The absence of Catherine had created a space, and that space carried implications that extended beyond scheduling. It touched on perception, on expectation, on the delicate balance between public duty and private life that defines the modern monarchy. And perhaps most telling of all was the absence of urgency in their outward response. Not because the situation lacked importance, but because urgency itself can signal instability. Instead, the palace chose composure. Measured, deliberate, unwavering composure. A reminder that even in moments of uncertainty, the institution does not react, it adapts. But adaptation, no matter how carefully executed, cannot fully shape how a story is received beyond those walls. Because while the palace may control its message, it cannot control interpretation. And as the internal strategy unfolded with quiet precision, a different narrative began to take shape outside its gates, one driven not by coordination, but by curiosity, concern, and an ever-growing demand for clarity. But outside the palace gates, the public reaction told a different story. Across headlines and social media feeds, the reaction was immediate and intense. Some expressed concern. Others questioned the timing. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. This wasn't just another royal scheduling change. This was something bigger. The shift in tone was impossible to ignore. Within hours, what began as a quiet announcement had transformed into a global conversation. News outlets that typically reported royal updates with measured neutrality began leaning into speculation, their language becoming sharper, more probing. Questions that might once have remained unspoken were now front and center. Why would Catherine, Princess of Wales, step back at such a critical moment? What had changed behind the scenes? And perhaps most telling of all, what wasn't being said. At the same time, the public response unfolded in layers. There was genuine concern, a wave of empathy that spread quickly as people connected with the human side of the story. Many saw not a royal figure stepping away from duty, but a mother making a difficult decision under pressure. That perspective brought a level of understanding that softened the narrative, at least initially. But as with any story surrounded by uncertainty, that empathy did not exist in isolation. Because alongside it, another current began to build. Speculation, fueled by fragments of information and the absence of clear answers, started to take shape. Social media platforms became the center of this shift, where theories, some grounded, others far more extreme, circulated at a speed the palace could not match. Each new interpretation added another layer, another possibility, another question. And with every passing hour, the gap between what was known and what was imagined continued to widen. Royal experts stepped into this growing conversation, offering insight, context, and in some cases, caution. They pointed to historical patterns, reminding audiences that the monarchy has long relied on controlled messaging and strategic silence. They emphasized that not every unanswered question signals a hidden crisis. And yet, even within those measured responses, there was an acknowledgement that this situation felt different. The timing, the significance of the event, the subtle shifts leading up to the announcement, all of it suggested a story that extended beyond a simple scheduling decision. The challenge, however, was not just the speculation itself, it was its amplification. Social media does not simply reflect conversation, it accelerates it. A single theory can evolve into a dominant narrative within hours, regardless of its accuracy. And in this case, the absence of detailed information created the perfect environment for that process to unfold. Each post, each comment, each shared opinion contributed to a growing sense that something important was being withheld. As the noise intensified, so did the pressure on the palace. Not in a direct or confrontational way, but in a more subtle, persistent form. A demand for clarity, for reassurance, for something that could anchor the conversation in certainty rather than possibility. Because while speculation can sustain attention, it cannot resolve it. And the longer it continues, the more it begins to shape perception in ways that are difficult to reverse. Yet even as that pressure mounted, the palace remained consistent in its approach, measured, controlled, unwilling to be drawn into the cycle of reaction. It was a strategy rooted in tradition, but one that now faced a modern challenge. A world where silence is no longer interpreted as stability, but often as uncertainty. And it was within that tension between control and curiosity, between privacy and public demand, that the story reached a critical point. Because as the conversation grew louder, as interpretations became more defined, something unexpected began to happen. The fragments started to align. The speculation began to narrow. And slowly, almost quietly, a clearer picture started to take shape beneath the noise. And as the noise reached its peak, a clearer picture finally began to emerge. In the end, the truth wasn't as scandalous as some had imagined, but it was far more profound. Because Catherine, Princess of Wales's decision wasn't about breaking tradition. It was about redefining it. And in doing so, she may have quietly reshaped what it means to be royal in a modern world. As the noise began to settle, and the speculation slowly gave way to a more grounded understanding, the narrative shifted, not toward a dramatic revelation, but toward something far more human. Reports, carefully worded and responsibly framed, began to suggest that the reason behind Catherine's absence was not rooted in controversy, but in priority. A convergence of personal considerations, possibly health-related, possibly centered around family, had reached a point where stepping back was no longer optional, but necessary. And while the palace never confirmed specifics, the tone of the unfolding story made one thing increasingly clear. This was a decision guided not by avoidance, but by responsibility of a different kind. That distinction mattered. Because within the monarchy, responsibility is often viewed through a singular lens: duty to the institution, to the public, to tradition. But Catherine's choice expanded that definition. It introduced a second dimension, one that does not replace duty, but exists alongside it. The responsibility to protect, to prioritize, to respond to immediate realities that cannot be postponed or delegated. And in doing so, she revealed a version of royal life that is rarely acknowledged so openly. What followed was not a collapse of expectation, but an evolution of it. The public, having moved through uncertainty and speculation, began to understand the decision in a new light, not as a disruption, but as a reflection of changing values within the monarchy itself, a recognition that strength is not always measured by constant visibility, but sometimes by the willingness to step back when it matters most. And that willingness, rather than weakening the institution, may in fact reinforce its relevance in a world that increasingly values authenticity over perfection. For Catherine, this moment marked something significant in her journey. Not a departure from her role, but a deepening of it. As a future queen, her influence will not be defined solely by adherence to tradition, but by her ability to navigate the space between tradition and reality. To uphold the expectations that come with the crown, while also acknowledging the human experiences that shape those who wear it. It is a balance that few have managed with such clarity, and one that will likely define her legacy in ways that extend far beyond a single decision. The implications reach further still, because every shift within the monarchy, no matter how subtle, sets a precedent. It reshapes the boundaries of what is possible, what is acceptable, what is expected. Catherine's decision, though rooted in a specific moment, carries the potential to influence how future generations approach the same challenges. It suggests that tradition is not as rigid as it once seemed, that it can adapt, evolve, and respond without losing its core identity. And perhaps that is the most powerful aspect of this entire story. Not the speculation, not the silence, not even the decision itself, but what it represents. A quiet transformation, a recalibration of priorities, a reminder that even within an institution built on centuries of continuity, change is not only inevitable, it is necessary. Because in the end, the monarchy does not endure by resisting change, but by absorbing it. By finding ways to remain constant while allowing its members to respond to the realities of their time. And in this case, Catherine's choice stands as a reflection of that delicate balance, one that honors both duty and humanity without diminishing either. Because sometimes, the most powerful royal statement isn't made from a balcony, but from the choices made behind closed doors. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.